Americans willing to cross a frozen river to kill you in your sleep on Christmas. Totally not kidding. We've done it. Yes, that is a meme that probably many of you have seen. It refers to the Battle of Trenton, when Americans who basically had very little left of their army did indeed cross a frozen river, the Delaware, to kill Hessians. Not really in their sleep, but surprising them as they woke up. So it's with that meme in mind and it being the day after Christmas that I thought we would dive into a little bit of Revolutionary War history. But we're going to do it from a unique perspective. Our friend Griffin Johnson, the Armchair historian, does a great job with this series of videos where he looks at historic events from a particular perspective. And in this case, he has done the American Revolution from the British perspective. As an American, and with an audience that is made up of more Americans than any other single group, many of us learned the story of our war for independence from our perspective. But what was the British perspective? Because that's an important question to ask. History is perspective, right? Everybody has a perspective. And I talk about this all the time. When you're reading history, ask yourself the question, what is this author's bias? What is their perspective? What are they trying to accomplish by telling this story? Because that's going to inform how much we should believe the story as told and how much we need to ask questions about what they might be misrepresenting or exaggerating or overly focusing on or ignoring. So I thought this would be interesting to do. The link is in the description as always, so you can check out the original content without my commentary. I know many of you are already familiar with the Armchair Historian. If not, definitely recommend you checking him out. He has been so supportive of vlogging through history as a channel, above and beyond at times, and how supportive he's been. So I definitely want to show that love back to him as much as we can. So let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Although the history of the United States as an independent nation begins with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, its roots reach back at least 20 more years with the start of the 7 Years' War. The fighting between its two main participants, Great Britain and France, spread across the globe, reaching also their neighboring colonial possessions in North America. By the end of the war, France had been beaten, leaving the British Empire in control over much of the eastern half of the continent. With its biggest competitor defeated, Britain now ruled the seas, as well as a third of all European trade.
So at this point, too, the area we know as the Louisiana Territory, which would be the next area to the west of there, to the west of the Mississippi River, which is largely uninhabited by Europeans. It's mostly just Native Americans, a few traders, things like that for the Europeans. But it is ceded to Spain in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. So a lot of people just assumed that Louisiana always stayed French for all that time. It didn't. It was ceded to Spain. It was during the Napoleonic Wars that France got it back and then immediately flipped it to the United States in the sale of the Louisiana Purchase.
By all accounts, this was a major win for the burgeoning empire. Yet beneath the surface, the sails of victory were weighed down by the anchors of debt.
And isn't it interesting how much finances play into this? When I was on with Mr. Beat a couple of weeks ago, one of the questions he asked me when we were asking each other questions had to do with whether or not I agreed with the idea that all of history could be viewed through economics. And that's definitely true if you think about it. So much of what became the American Revolution had to do with economics, had to do with trade and taxation and those sorts of things. And the French Revolution, a lot of that has to do with economics, and it's the aftermath of them going into heavy debt in part because of funding the American Revolution and supporting it through troops and Navy support and things like that. So a lot of the same problems that France is dealing with in the 1780s are the problems that the British were dealing with in the 1760s.
Amounting to a total of £133 million, the debt marked a significant hit to the British economy and pushed Parliament to take drastic financial measures.
And it's important to note that £133 million, that's billions today.
The Royal Navy, which had helped Britain to victory, was to become one of the primary losers in a series of cuts, which would see its budget plummet from £7 million in 1762 to £2.8 million in the aftermath of the war, and dropping to as little as £1.5 million in 1769.
If you're the British, one of the reasons you need a big navy is because of these overseas colonies that you're trying to maintain. Now, at this point, they don't have India yet. They don't have a lot of the other territories they're going to acquire in the late 1700s, early 1800s. But still, a big, powerful navy protects them, but also helps them to project their power elsewhere.
Measures, however, only accounted for a sliver of the debt, and British citizens would be forced to do most of the heavy lifting in the form of a series of new and higher taxes. However, the empire would have little time to recuperate. Just as the embers of the 7 Years' War were dying out, a new wildfire erupted when a confederation of dissatisfied Native American nations in the Great Lakes region took up arms against the American colonists settling in their territory. In response, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which banned American colonists, with the exception of licensed fur traders, from settling west of the Alleghenies.
This is so important in understanding the causes of the American Revolution. I know we love to talk about taxation without representation as being the cause, but settlement west of the Alleghenies are a part of the larger Appalachian Mountains, and that is how it's pronounced, which run all the way from New England down into the Deep South, and banning settlers who... One of the main draws for people coming from England to the colonies is land, because England is small, it's heavily populated, and you're going from that to a place that's huge and sparsely populated. There's land. And so as more and more people are arriving in the colonies, they're pushing further and further west. It's the beginning stages of Manifest Destiny. And banning them from that land that was controlled by the Native American tribes, especially the Iroquois Confederacy and others up in the north, this is a major factor.
Fearing a reaction from the disgruntled frontiersmen, Britain promptly reinforced its North American military presence, further increasing their debt at a rate of £320,000 a year. Thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. Now is the perfect time to sign up.
It's kind of become this joke, right? This meme that everybody gets sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, and they have reached out to me, and I haven't taken them up on it yet.
And enjoy Raid's brutal boss battles, deep tactical gameplay, the best graphics around, and hundreds of champions, and the new mythical champions. One of my favorites is Grush the Mangler, an HP tank who adds a variety of buffs and debuffs to your team. Alright, let's open up some shards. Don't forget you can also summon champions using shards, level up the good shards and use them, or sacrifice the bad ones to level up the champion you have. Alright, I unlocked Tree Shield Knot. That's not bad for a support character. From now until November 10th...
It's weird seeing him without the facial hair. Even Griffin can grow a beard and I can't. You see this? See this? I haven't shaved for a couple of days, so you can see what I'm dealing with here, okay? Like right in there, it just won't grow. And where I do grow it, it's just thin. But then I get the real dark mustache that has no trouble growing in.
Delve into Raid's Haunted Graveyard for a chance to win awesome in-game items and real-life prizes. Simply download Raid using the link in the description, copy your in-game player ID, then head over to raidyard.plarium.com. Enter your player ID and venture into the Haunted Graveyard for a chance to win an epic and legendary Halloween-themed Raid Champion or Amazon gift cards with a total value of $20,000. Click my link in the description or scan my QR code to get insane bonuses like Epic Champion Knight Errant and other useful items like energy refills, skill tomes, and XP boosters. King George III, the British monarch, now found himself in a critical juncture. His empire needed to find a way out of its increasing debt, but with his people already heavily taxed, and with the budget of critical institutions like the Royal Navy cut to the extreme, the only natural recourse seemed to put a shared burden on his American subjects. Besides, it was only fair that the colonials pay for their way for the added protection they were receiving from the army. The colonists, however, had grown increasingly distant from their motherland, and the Americans would prove unwilling to meekly bow down before the demands of some faraway king.
And that's an important point to make, right? Is that by this point, while we're thinking about British colonies, we have to think about this as this is not a group of people who were all born and raised in England or in Scotland or in Ireland who have come over, and so they still have really strong emotional and familial ties to the motherland. In many cases, by this point, we're talking about third, fourth, fifth generation Americans, people who have not only been born and raised and only lived in the American colonies, but so were their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. So there's no real emotional tie at this point to the old country. It's no different than, think about it in your own family. If your family, like in my case, my closest immigrant ancestor came to the United States in 1866. Since 1866, all of my ancestors have been in the United States who came to the United States. So I think my last ancestor to die in another country was in 1869 in Birmingham, England. So since then, so there's no ties for my family to England beyond what I see on a piece of paper. And that was the case for these folks too.
The first signs of dissent came when Britain introduced the Sugar Act in 1764, which taxed sugar, molasses, as well as other imported products purchased at a cheaper rate from sources outside of the empire. The act also forced captains of merchant ships to post bonds and provide exhaustive cargo invoices, while also allowing Royal Navy personnel to search and seize vessels suspected of smuggling goods. Soon,
that's a really important point too, is that it's not simply just the tax, it's the ramifications of the tax, right? Because you're trying to enforce a tax, and because there's the possibility that exists of people trying to get around the tax, now you're dealing with smuggling, and that means you've got to start violating people's privacy more, you've got to start searching and seizing things, and so this is all kind of a snowball effect.
Angry tradesmen were knocking on London's doors, arguing that the Sugar Act was infringing on their right to free trade, set out in a previous charter with the British government. Many colonists...
Notice they're not complaining about the tax itself. They're complaining about, again, the ramifications of the tax and how it affects their ability to trade with others to get around the tax.
Were unaware that the Sugar Act was just the beginning of taxation efforts in America. The Stamp Act was soon introduced, requiring citizens to pay taxes on a range of items by purchasing stamps. A similar version of this act was already providing close to half of the budget of the government from the pockets of English citizens, and would...
There's no income tax at this point, so you have to get really creative, and that's true in the United States up until the 20th century. Is that there's no standard regular income tax. There are income taxes that get introduced here and there for short periods of time, like in the American Civil War. But so you got to get really creative on how you're going to make your income.
Would soon raise a large sum from its American subjects as well. However, these American subjects proved to be of a different mind as mass outrage erupted in the colonies, ultimately leading to the act being repealed in 1766. The British Parliament, worried about losing face and wanting to avoid being seen as losing authority over its American possessions, made sure to exchange the Stamp Act with the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had full control over lawmaking in the American colonies. Soon.
Why would they say that? Because the American colonies, by this point, places like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, are starting to exert more and more authority for themselves. And this is one of the reasons why they were demanding representation in Parliament, is because they had already tasted that with their colonial legislatures that have a lot of local autonomy. So they want that same level of representation at the level of the British government where these decisions are being made.
Another tax on imported items, such as tea and glass, was introduced under the Townshend Act, further incensing the colonists and leading Samuel Adams to write a letter on behalf of the Massachusetts legislature calling for a boycott of English products until the taxes were repealed. Like many others, Adams was outraged that the Parliament believed it had the right to force Americans to pay for the government's expenses without having American representatives in Parliament. Soon, the slogan, "No taxation without representation," would become the battle cry for colonists protesting British attempts to tax the colonies.
Now, here's the crazy thing about this. Let's say the British had given them some level of representation. And isn't it funny, though, that the United States was born out of this idea of no taxation without representation, and yet we have certain parts of United States territory, the District of Columbia, for example, which pay taxes but don't have a voting representation in the House of Representatives. They have a delegate, a non-voting delegate, just as many of the territories do, so that they can kind of be represented, but they don't have a vote. So you could possibly argue that they don't really have representation. But what I was getting at with that was that, let's say the colonies, let's even say that each colony had been given one member of Parliament. Would that have changed anything? No, the taxes would have still been levied, but maybe there's no argument to be made for no taxation without representation, and maybe this all goes away. Of course, no taxation without representation was the rallying cry. It was hardly the only issue.
Back in Windsor Castle, King George followed the developments from America with a remarkable sense of empathy for his dissatisfied subjects.
That's absolutely true.
While discussing the Stamp Act, he stated that it first deprived the Americans by restraining their trade from the means of acquiring wealth, and then taxed them.
This is a great point. King George III was not the tyrant that he has been spun as by American history. In fact, so much of that, you got to understand, by the time George III becomes king in 1760, he inherits from his grandfather, George II. A lot of the power rests with Parliament, especially when it comes to taxation. So really, this is more about guys like Lord North and their government than it is about King George III.
Britain's Prime Minister, however, Frederick North, or Lord North, saw things differently and remained a firm proponent of maintaining Parliament's right of authority over the colonies, which was seen as a vital component of British liberty. The matter of taxation was now increasingly becoming a matter of power and hierarchy. Similarly, American dissent was soon to transform into all-out rebellion. The city of Boston, home of public agitator Samuel Adams, was known as the beating...
That's a great way to put it. Public agitator Samuel Adams. 100% accurate.
...heart of American unrest. Latent tensions against British rule would come to a head on March...
So if you look at maps of Boston at the time of the Revolution and you look at maps of Boston today, you'll notice a huge difference in what the map looks like. And that's because Boston, a lot of the land in Boston is man-made. Like, they filled in a lot of the water. So a lot of places where there was water in the 1770s is land now. Charleston, South Carolina is the same way. I was just there a few weeks ago, and a lot of what was then part of Charleston Harbor is now land.
March 5th, 1770, when 400 Bostonians harassed and assaulted 8 British soldiers, who, in the heat of the moment, resorted to firing their muskets into the crowd, injuring 6 and killing 5. News about the Boston Massacre, as the colonists coined the incident, spread like wildfire.
Propaganda.
And only added...
This is the power of propaganda and spin and how you cause people to perceive things. This was almost certainly not a massacre in the traditional sense. These guys were defending themselves. Nobody even knows for sure how it started, but it's not like they had a bunch of troops and they were marching through the city executing colonists. It was a tragic, tragic accident, evidenced by the fact that John Adams, a patriot, represents them in court and gets them, for the most part, gets them off of all the serious charges.
To the unrest in the city. About 4 years later, the situation had escalated to the point that Parliament felt forced to enact the Coercive Acts, which included the reinforcement of the Boston garrison by 4 additional regiments of regulars.
And this is a situation now where you have a ratcheting up of the tension on both sides. Both sides are pushing this more and more. On the American side, they're agitating, they're causing things like they really egged on these troops and kind of created the circumstances of the Boston Massacre. You've got things like the Boston Tea Party. You've got other things happening. But the response by the British is to ramp up the tension further, is to crack down even more. And that only causes more of a response. And this is just one of those hurtling out of control situations.
To the belief that this added military presence would finally quell the riotous colonials, the sight of the hated redcoats in the streets, and the fact that the British soldiers were to be quartered and supplied by colonists only further angered the American public. By February 2nd, 1775, the situation in Massachusetts had reached a boiling point, as Lord North officially declared the colony to be in a state of rebellion. The commander-in-chief of British forces in America, General Thomas Gage, was promptly ordered to nip the rebellion in the bud by capturing its leaders.
And Gage is another one of those guys who's very sympathetic to the American side of things and had a long history in America. He knew George Washington. They had served together on the Braddock expedition. George Washington's there, Thomas Gage is there, Charles Lee is there, Daniel Boone is a part of that. A lot of these guys who are going to make a name for themselves in the coming decades.
Gage first moved against a known rebel ammunition store in the town of Concord in order to deprive his enemy of gunpowder. However, on April 19th, Gage's advancing men walked into a gathering of colonial militia at Lexington Green. Tensions exploded when an unknown soldier from either side fired his musket, prompting the British to fire in force at the colonial militia. Word of the incident reached other militia groups in the area, and soon the British found themselves ambushed by armed colonials, ultimately resulting in a total of 20% casualties, including several key leaders.
And if you want to hear more details about that particular part of the American Revolution, I did a reaction to the video from History Rebels, and we are going to do more of theirs in the near future. And I'll put a link up at the end to let you see that.
Not wishing to lose more of his men in surprise attacks, Gage ordered a retreat. After reorganizing his men, Gage was ordered to hold on to Boston, which would allow the Royal Navy to land reinforcements. As colonial militias laid siege to the city, it was decided that British troops would make a stand at Dorchester Heights and Charlestown to the north of Boston, which included the high ground at Bunker and Breed's Hill. However, the British were up for a bloody surprise when they discovered that the Americans had already set up a series of formidable defenses on Breed's Hill.
And they did it pretty much overnight. Like, they arrived overnight and set up these defenses. It was really quite impressive.
Casualties mounted as the infantry assaulted the position, and despite coming out on top when the musket fire finally fell silent, British losses had been such that the army would be put on the defensive for nearly a year. Even the previously empathetic King George had lost his patience. Lamenting Britain's relatively soft approach to the American colonies as having been a sign of weakness, he now urged the might of the British power to bear down on his rebellious subjects.
Yeah, it's important to note here that, and I just paused Griffin in a really unflattering pose there, up until early 1776, the majority of people, even patriots, even people who strongly opposed these taxes and were strongly opposed to the British government, were not willing to take the step of independence. They were still hoping for reconciliation. And the funny thing is that the British pretty much gave in to just about everything that the Americans had been demanding. But by this point, it was too late. And the push for independence becomes stronger and stronger, and they make they basically label an olive branch, kind of reaching out to make peace to King George after the fighting has already happened at places like Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord. And George's response, the government's response to the olive branch petition, is basically, you are in rebellion, we're going to hang you unless you restore yourself to our good graces. And if you do that, we'll receive you with tenderness and mercy. If not, you're going to be hanged as traitors.
On August 23rd, the Proclamation of Rebellion was officially released to the public. At home, American assets were frozen, while American ships were banned from entering British ports. Moreover, there was a significant division within the communities of the British colonies. Many British loyalists who were sympathetic to the Crown found themselves in precarious situations, facing hostility and often being ostracized by their American neighbors. Many of them had to flee their homes, relocating to Canada or returning to Britain. This internal division and the plight of the Loyalists was a testament to the multifaceted nature of the conflict. In the meantime, 20,000 regulars were dispatched to America. Additionally, around 10,000 troops, often mistakenly called mercenaries, were sent from German states. Most notably, the Hessians. Contrary to common belief, these Hessians were not individual soldiers for hire, but were part of organized units leased by German princes to the British Crown.
Remember, the British Crown is German. I mean, King George III is the first member of his dynasty who was born in England and spoke English as a first language. His father, Frederick, was Prince of Wales, died before he could become king. But his grandfather and great-grandfather, George II, George I, both spoke German as a first language. Both were from Germany, from Hanover. And so George III is really the first kind of English king of the Hanover dynasty. So they've got strong ties to Germany, always have. And so they've got these, really, I mean, if you think about it, the reason that they're spun as mercenaries is because the British are paying for it. So I guess that's really the only difference between them and, say, French units helping the Americans, is that the Americans aren't paying for the French units, and so you can't really argue that they've been hired as mercenaries.
Their presence was not a mere commercial transaction, but a complex web of political and diplomatic ties.
Yep.
The rebels, hearing of these reinforcements, sent the olive branch petition to London in hopes of preventing a formal war from being declared. The petition restated the colonists' appreciation for the union of Britain and the colonies, and that they had merely taken up arms in response to the unfair measures taken against them. As such, the colonials were allegedly more than ready to restore peace if these issues were to be addressed. King George, however, decided to ignore the petition and responded to America's Declaration of Independence by accusing the power-hungry leaders in the colonies of having openly rejected the British government, and with the ongoing hostilities being the only right response. Reactions from the British media were mixed, with some newspapers praising the Americans' bravery, while others wrote mockingly about the Declaration's supposed pretentious prose.
So, and it's interesting is that while all of this is happening in 76, the British have sent this massive army that nearly crushes the rebellion right at the time that they declare independence. And I went into a lot of detail about all of this in my video on 1776, and I'll put the link up for that as well at the end, so you can check that out and learn a lot more of the details about the political situation and the negotiations that are going on, because Admiral and General Howe have come with limited ability to pardon and things like that. And so they're going to at least nominally attempt peace negotiations, even though they really couldn't offer much.
The fighting around Boston continued during the following months until General George Washington finally managed to capture Dorchester Heights on March 4, 1776, forcing General William Howe, who had succeeded Gage as commander-in-chief, to evacuate the city.
And the Americans were in position now with all these guns they got from Fort Ticonderoga where they could have shelled the British in Boston, but they wanted Boston intact. They didn't want it destroyed. And so they negotiated a situation in which they would allow the British to escape unharmed in return for not setting fire to the town of Boston or not having it destroyed by the artillery.
Having to come up with a new plan, the British command decided to focus its efforts on New York. In late June, after landing his army at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, Howe called a march toward New York City, where they were met by Washington's men. During the fighting, which took place in the present-day northwestern Brooklyn Heights in heavy rain and fog, Howe nearly managed to encircle the colonials, but rough winds on the East River prevented him from closing the gap. Close to 10,000 men managed to escape as dense fog masked their retreat. Despite having failed to crush the colonial army, the victorious British now felt confident that their military superiority over Washington's makeshift army would ultimately and inevitably win them the war.
And they had every reason to think that. Washington got outsmarted at Brooklyn Heights. He gets outsmarted repeatedly in the coming campaigns. He very rarely wins a major battle against the British, but he survives. And he pulls off the miracles at Trenton and Princeton, and that's enough to keep things going until the French intervene.
Howe, in fact, was so encouraged by his victory that he initially attempted to get the Americans to restore peace by retracting the Declaration of Independence. When this proposal predictably went nowhere, the general moved to secure New York City and destroy the remaining colonial troops. By the end of the year, Britain seemed to be poised to win the war. Their main stumbling block, however, would come from their arch-nemesis, the French. As the British Army failed to deliver the anticipated knockout blow throughout the winter and into the following year, France decided to support the rebellion. Back in Britain, King George worried that the French were planning to make a move against the West Indies, which were a key part of British global trade. In response, 5,000 troops stationed in Philadelphia were withdrawn to reinforce the islands in 1778.
You absolutely cannot understate the importance of the French entering the war. And it's really the Battle of Saratoga, which a lot of that credit has to go to Benedict Arnold rather than Horatio Gates. It's news of that battle that shows the French, okay, now's the time. The Americans really do have a chance to win this thing. And so they enter in, and this has ramifications on the continent because, like he said, the British who have captured Philadelphia, they now have to pull out. They have to consolidate their forces. They have to spread themselves out. So they can't cover all the bases that they had been. And so they're really going to start to shift not only to the Caribbean, but also to the American South is where the theater of war is going to shift to. That allows them, among other things, to keep their Navy closer together because they're supporting the South and the Caribbean rather than all the way up in the North.
The start of a major diversion of resources away from the American mainland to the Caribbean, eventually leading to British commanders begging for more soldiers and even prisoners being sent to make up for the lack of manpower. Meanwhile, the escalating war was starting to wear down on the patience of British citizens, who had to deal with ever higher taxes, while neighboring Ireland, in the meantime, suffered in the face of a major recession due to the halt on American trade. Yet despite these setbacks at home, British forces continued to gain important victories on the battlefield. In spring of 1780, General Sir Henry Clinton attacked Charleston, South Carolina. The Northern theater had stalemated, and it was hoped that a campaign in the southern colonies, where British loyalists were more common, would finally bring the Americans to their knees.
100% true. The reasons I already stated, it's closer to the Caribbean, which makes it easier to kind of consolidate your forces, especially your naval power, but there was absolutely a hope that loyalists would rise up, and much of the fighting that takes place in the war in the South takes place between loyalists and patriots, battles like Kings Mountain. There's very few like regular redcoat British soldiers at Kings Mountain. This is fought between Americans.
Amidst the war in America, the British were also fiercely defending the Rock of Gibraltar in Europe, commencing in 1779. This great siege of Gibraltar, a grueling conflict against Spain and France, lasted for nearly 4 years and was the largest battle of the entire war, despite no actual Americans being present.
Yeah, and again, this is stretching British resources. And now you're going to have to start making decisions about what's most important to us. Do we keep pouring resources into this situation in the colonies? And on the American side, it's the same deal. They're stretched about as thin as they can go. They're not able to pay their soldiers. They're not able to feed their soldiers. They're not really able to effectively equip their soldiers without a lot of help from European powers. And by 1781, both sides are really almost at the breaking point.
While outnumbered and facing naval blockades, the British showcased their military prowess, employing innovative tactics and engineering feats like the construction of the Gibraltar galleries, or tunnels. Their tenacious defense eventually led to victory in 1783, solidifying British control over the strategic peninsula. Back in the colonies, British military prowess was also present. Charleston fell to the British after a 6-week siege, capturing an entire colonial army of about 5,000 men. Emboldened, Clinton visualized a sweeping pincer strategy against the Americans. He designated the southern operations to General Charles Cornwallis and moved north to marshal the troops around New York.
And what's cool about the Southern Theater, and I'm hoping maybe in 2024 sometime, to go down and do a whole video series about the Southern campaign and visit those battlefields, because this is some of the best stuff of the Revolution, where you've got two of the best generals going up against each other. Cornwallis is one of the best generals the British have in North America, and eventually it starts out with Horatio Gates, who's incompetent, but Nathaniel Greene might be the best American general in the Revolution. And one of George Washington's great strengths is his ability to see greatness in others and empower them. And he never wanted Gates to be in charge of the Southern Army. He always wanted Greene, and he eventually got Greene. And Greene's the one who's able to go down there and really give Cornwallis more than he bargained for.
The objective was a coordinated advance, with Cornwallis pushing the Americans through the Carolinas and Virginia, and Clinton's army converging from New York. By February of 1781, Cornwallis was marching his men through North Carolina. He hoped to force General Nathaniel Greene's weaker American army to face him in battle. However, time for Cornwallis was running out as supplies were wearing thin, and his men began suffering from exhaustion.
How do you defeat a superior force that is stronger in every aspect of warfare than you are? You drag them deeper and deeper into your own territory, away from their base of supply. You force that larger, more powerful, better supplied force to spread out, and you wait until you have an opportunity to turn on them. That's how Texas wins their War of Independence. It's how the United States wins its War of Independence.
On March 14th, Greene's men were finally located at Guilford Courthouse. Once again, British superiority on the battlefield showed, but their victory was bought at a considerable cost, with 25% of Cornwallis's men having become casualties during the fighting. Greene, in the meantime, had managed to escape the field of battle with the rest of his army. Having run out of patience, Cornwallis made the decision to bypass the Carolinas and move straight toward Virginia. After reorganizing his men, the British ordered a march toward the inland part of Yorktown. Here, however, the situation would take a turn for the worse.
It's a trap!
In September, a French fleet...
Well, the point was that General Clinton was supposed to come down. He's been sitting in New York for a couple of years now, and George Washington's been sitting outside of New York for a couple of years now, and Washington wanted to attack New York and retake arguably the most important city in British hands at this point. And the French said, no, we're going for Yorktown. You've got our fleet available for just a couple of weeks before they have to head back down to the Caribbean. This is your chance. And it's a perfect storm of events at Yorktown that only is possible because Clinton basically abandons Cornwallis to his fate.
managed to penetrate British defenses and block access to the Chesapeake during the Battle of the Capes. Cornwallis's men were now cut off from reinforcements and resupply and would be forced to dig in and await relief. By September 28th, an American army, reinforced with French troops, began to lay siege to Yorktown. Up in New York, General Clinton, heading the northern pincer, remained relatively calm. Writing about the situation, he stated that Cornwallis is safe enough unless a superior fleet shows itself, in which case I despair of ever seeing peace restored to this miserable country.
Well, you're 100%
His
right
main
about
concern
that.
was with Washington's army, whom he believed were preparing to advance on New York with the help of French ships.
And this is one of those moments where Washington's spy network, if you've ever seen Turn Washington Spies, it's got some fictionalized elements, but the major stuff is accurate. And his spy network convinces Cornwallis that Washington is planning a joint French-American attack on New York. And Washington's able to slip away with his army and march down to Yorktown. And by the time Clinton realizes what's happened, it's too late.
Staten Island. Further rumors about the French ships sailing up from the West Indies did little to soothe his concerns, and persuaded him to remain cautious rather than hasten his force to the aid of Cornwallis. Washington, however, had no intention of attacking New York, and was, in fact, moving his men southward toward the trapped British army. The situation in Yorktown in the meantime was deteriorating by the day. Cornwallis had already abandoned his outer lines, but without supplies, his men could only hold on for so long.
Yep.
On October 19th, the defense fell apart as the 8,000 remaining British soldiers laid down their arms. Although the disastrous defeat at Yorktown was an enormous blow to
kind of a cool fact about that is that Cornwallis did not attend the surrender ceremony. He sent his subordinate, Charles O'Hara, to surrender, and so then Washington had his subordinate, General Lincoln, accept the surrender. And I think Lincoln was the guy who surrendered Charleston. But Charles O'Hara will then later on, not too many years down the road, have to surrender to Napoleon Bonaparte. Only guy in history who can claim he had to surrender to both George Washington and Napoleon.
The British Army, King George urged his commanders to carry on the fight as if nothing had changed. In reality, it was clear that the empire could not hope to reasonably sustain the costs in manpower, supplies, and funds that were required to prolong its efforts and to vanquish the rebellion.
The war didn't end at Yorktown. Yorktown's the beginning of the end. There's fighting in 1782. There's a battle of Blue Licks, Kentucky. My sixth great-grandfather was killed there. At that battle, he was a lieutenant named James McGuire. You've got prominent people like John Laurens, whose father had been the president of Continental Congress and been held at the Tower of London, who was killed in 1782. It's only 1783 when the war officially comes to an end, and that's because it's going to take the British Empire some time. I guess you're not really a British Empire yet, but it's going to take the British government some time to accept the reality that they can't keep funding this war. They can't keep sending men to die in this war.
Moreover, the important American victory at Yorktown had likely only emboldened the colonial spirits. In Parliament, the writing seemed to be on the wall. America was here to stay, and the sheer effort it would require to attempt to put the proverbial eagle back into its cage was simply deemed not worth the cost. A few more skirmishes unfolded before the peace negotiations began. The Treaty of Paris, finalized in 1783, brought an official end to the American War for Independence. In this pivotal agreement, Britain made numerous significant concessions.
Yeah.
They recognized the United States as a sovereign nation and ceded vast territories east of the Mississippi River to the new republic. The Americans were also granted important fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. The treaty defined the boundaries between British North America, now Canada, and the United States, setting the Great Lakes region as the northern border of the U.S. Additionally, Britain returned Florida to Spain, having previously captured it, and the Mediterranean island of Minorca, which the British had held, was ceded back to Spain. On November 25th, the last of the British troops departed from New York. While the treaty marked the end of the Revolutionary War, the sting of losing the American colonies lingered with King George III and the British establishment. It would necessitate several tumultuous decades, punctuated by conflicts like the War of 1812, before the two nations established the deep-rooted alliance they share today.
That was good. I enjoyed that. Great job as always, Griffin. I'm going to throw up those links that I talked about to some other videos on these topics that I've done that you can check out. I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.